if you look at our society much at all, you can see pretty clearly that people are searching for something, whether we call that fulfillment, value, satisfaction. But on some levels, you can say people are just searching for love. They want to be accepted. Most of you, I'm guessing, can at least sing some part of the theme song for the sitcom Cheers. I want to go where everybody knows my name. Right? Maybe you can, maybe you can't, I don't know. But the reality is that people want to be accepted. They want to feel loved, but sometimes we search for love in the wrong places. We search for validation, for worth in places that aren't necessarily beneficial. And I don't want to necessarily speak too ill of our society, but you can look at our society and see that it's not necessarily set up to promote healthiness, to promote healthy relationships, healthy lives, healthy situations. And one of the prime examples, as I was thinking about this, is the child support system. Now, some of you have had to pay or receive child support, and it's a hassle. Nobody grows up saying, you know what, I want to have child support. Nobody wishes for that, but it's a reality in our society, and it's one that unfortunately is probably necessary because some people just don't want to fulfill their obligation. But if you look at the child support system, you see it's a federally funded program run by the states. And so the states and local governments facilitate the cases and work with clients and get everything situated. But for every dollar the state spends, the federal government gives them 66 cents. And which on some levels, well, that's not a lot. But from the state's perspective, that's a pretty good deal. The state can have good paying jobs or good jobs for 33 cents on the dollar, 34 cents on the dollar. So it's a discount for the state. And so the state has no incentive to lessen the cases for child support. In fact, the system is set up, well, the more cases we have, the more money we get. And again, I'm not trying to devalue our society. It's a necessary part of our world, unfortunately. But we see how society is not necessarily set up to promote healthy families. It's set up to, you follow the money, you can find the intent of what an organization is actually trying to accomplish. And as I said, we sometimes look for love in all the wrong places that don't always honor Jesus. But fortunately, Jesus can give us wisdom and insight and direction for what it means to seek love and for what it means to live in fulfilling relationships. And he has this encounter with the religious leaders, and most of his encounters with the religious leaders are about correcting truth or giving a fuller explanation of what God wants for his people. And we find in Matthew chapter 19 that this happens because the religious leaders come in verse 3 and they ask Jesus this question to try to trap him. It said, should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for any reason? And so they stop there. Now with this question, there's some underlying connotations that are at play here. Because when they came to test Jesus, and this word test is pretty specific. It's used another place in the Gospel of Matthew. It's used in Matthew chapter 4. And Matthew chapter 4 is when Jesus is led out into the wilderness to be tested or tempted by Satan, where Satan tried to get Jesus to sin and just turn away from God. And so we see this parallel. And I'm not saying that the religious leaders were satanic. Most religious leaders were probably trying their best to honor God. They were misinformed in many ways and misdirected in some of their intent. But these weren't necessarily just evil people. Maybe there's some that were. But it's not as though they are satanic, but we see that there's a conflict between the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, and the kingdom of this world. And so the religious leaders represent the kingdom of this world, and it's trying to test Jesus, to tempt Jesus, to get Jesus off course. And that's what the kingdom of this world does to us. It tries to pull us away from Jesus, maybe in ways that are disguised as good or claim to be good. the world doesn't just, it's like a wolf in sheep clothing at time of conceals the actual true intent. And so they have this question, is it permissible for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? Now, before I go any further, if you've been divorced, this is not directed at you. You know, some of you are divorced, particularly if you've been divorced for a while. What I think Jesus, what he does for us is he says, here is your life. Now that you know me, we've got something different coming. With Jesus, we start fresh. Not that we ignore what happened, and so this is not to make you feel bad if you have experienced this. It's to say, how do we seek this love and attention that we so desperately desire in positive, Jesus-honoring ways? Because this question from the religious leaders was strange. It was abnormal. It wasn't part of the normal rabbinic debate that they would have. You know, there's sometimes Jesus has interactions with the religious leaders, and the question that they have is a common philosophical and theological debate that they would have. This wasn't. This was just trying to trap Jesus. And part of why it's odd is that the Jews have a very high view of marriage. Particularly in the ancient world, you think of the Jews, it was a big deal for someone to get married. Other cultures, you know, marriage, divorce, polygamy, all that kind of stuff was prevalent. But for the Jews, particularly at this time, this was a big deal. And there were different thoughts of what it meant to get divorced or what did allow someone to get divorced. And I recognize that there are certain situations in which the relationship has gotten to such an unhealthy point that someone can't stay in it. But for the Jews, their high view of marriage stemmed from the fact of they felt as though the marriage was not about you. They made marriage not selfish. They made it about serving others. But divorce was still legal in certain circumstances for the Jews, and it's legal for us today. But it brings me to the point of having the right doesn't make it right. And you can apply that to all sorts of areas. Just because you can legally do something doesn't mean it honors Jesus. And we have to make sure we don't frame it as, is it allowed? Because if we say, is it allowed, then what we're asking is, what's the minimum I can do and still get into heaven? Tell you what, that doesn't honor Jesus at all. Jesus calls us to something deeper than just doing the minimum to get by. I can't remember the phrase. I don't know if it's C's or D's. Maybe it's D's get degrees in school. That's not good. That's not beneficial. Jesus doesn't call us just to the minimum. He calls us to something deeper. And the religious leaders, their debate on marriage here, particularly, there was different lines of thoughts with all sorts of things, marriage included, and there are different lines of thoughts between people today of they'd have debates on when marriage was or wasn't, or when divorce was or wasn't permissible, and there were some that were more conservative, some that were more liberal, but the Jews had a very high view of marriage. This was a big deal. Marriage was a big deal. I fear marriage is becoming less of a big deal in our society. And so what we tend to do is we tend to take it on a test run. We got to test things out before we actually get married. And so there are many who have this thought that, we're going to cohabitate before we actually get married. Now, I don't know if we use the word cohabitate anymore, but it's about living together. And essentially, the entire relationship is just like somebody who is married, but you aren't legally married. But with cohabitation, I fear there's a huge temptation to make it extremely selfish. If you enter a relationship, regardless of what that is, and say, what can I get out of it? That changes how the relationship functions. It changes the dynamics, whether you're talking about a romantic relationship, whether you're talking about a friendship, whether you're talking about a business partnership. If somebody feels exploited, they're not going to trust you. They're not going to want to engage deeper in the relationship. So if you enter a relationship saying, how will my needs be met? You're entering a dangerous place. But one of the differences that I find intriguing between marriage and cohabitation is that marriage has a very defined starting point. Cohabitation doesn't necessarily. It can happen by accident. It can kind of sneak in. And, hey, all of a sudden we're living together. And I don't even know what sociologists define as people who are living together. But it can happen by accident. But studies show that those who cohabitate aren't necessarily more successful in their relationships. In fact, there's psychological damage, there's commitment questions. But I find that the studies show that those who cohabitate are 2 times more likely to have major depression, anxiety, or substance abuse. And they're 3.5 times more likely to have violent behavior towards their partner. That's a dangerous thing to actually allow ourselves to engage. So I come back to the point, having the right doesn't make it right. Just because we say we can doesn't mean it actually honors Jesus. But one of the things that I find is with the church is that we're really, really good at highlighting certain sins and ignoring other sins. And maybe I was being a little overdramatic with that, but we tend to say, well, this is sinful, but then we ignore these things over here. And so I start with this cohabitation situation to say, too many times we focus on homosexual sins and we neglect heterosexual ones. We say, well, we're just going to ignore that. You know what? That can be redeemed easier, we say, or something of that nature. But the reality is we can't allow sin. And we think of cohabitation as both statistically and relationally detrimental to a couple. But Jesus answers their question, and I think this is important. It's not about whether you should or shouldn't be allowed to do it. He goes deeper than that. And the religious leaders, he talks to them. He says, haven't you read the scriptures? It's clear from the beginning that God made them male and female. And he said, this explains why a man must leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two, but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. There are several affirmations that Jesus has here, several fundamental truths. And probably the first one that is extremely important for us is Jesus affirmed that God created male and female. Now, that in our world today is becoming a lot muddier. That distinction is a lot less clear, but we find Jesus is talking about how God created and going down to the basics of God created male and female. And we find this from Genesis chapter 1:27. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. But then he goes on and he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they are one. Now, this is not necessarily just a rejection of, I no longer care about you. But I'm sure some of you, maybe you know somebody, maybe it's not you, maybe you know somebody who's married, who's had some in-law troubles. Just can't let go of that past life or something like that. They're more connected to their parents or their siblings than they are the new family, the new spouse that they now have. Jesus, the two are one, which means that you no longer have your first allegiance to your parents, to your family. And Jesus is quoting Genesis 2:24, which says, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. But one of the things here, this is in Genesis chapter 2 that I just read. God said that. Genesis chapter 3 is when sin enters the world. Genesis 1 and 2 is God's creation, and we see it's good and it's perfect. And so the fact that in Genesis chapter 2, marriage enters the scene, we see that it is God ordained. It's not a human construct. It's not something that humans sat together and said, we should do this. God initiated and ordained this. Marriage can be good. But Jesus also goes on to affirm that one becomes two, or two becomes one. And he adds emphasis to this by he says it twice. He says the two become one 2 different times in verses 5 and 6 in Matthew chapter 19. But the Hebrew word for marriage, I think, can help unpack this a little bit. It's kiddushin, which has a connotation of sanctification and consecration. Now, the word consecrate means to give of yourself completely. A lot of times we talk spiritually about this, of, consecrate yourself to God. Give of yourself completely to God and be transformed into His image. But in order for a marriage to actually be successful, what we find from the Jewish understanding, and Jesus pulls this out, is that you have to give of yourself completely. You can't just give half-heartedly. You can't give 50% or 75%. You have to give of yourself completely. And when you give of yourself completely, you lay your life down for your spouse. You sacrifice for your spouse. You love them. You support them. And some of you have instances in your marriage where you say, oh, this is great. Some of you have had heartache, said this didn't work for me. Or this was a struggle, and this just didn't bring fulfillment that it could have. But Jesus says, don't separate what God has created. Now, I recognize we live in a sinful world. And I'm sharing things today that maybe this just is frustrating for you to hear. Maybe it's disheartening for you to hear. Maybe it makes you angry to hear what Jesus is talking about in our human relationships today. But the reality is Jesus knows we're sinful. He knows we live in a world and we interact with other people who are sinful. And why I don't want to say it's unattainable, but he's talking about this is what God has created. This is what God has ordained. This is the direction God has called us to live. Marriage was created by God, and thus it's above these cultural norms, above the society expectations. We derive it from God because this marriage, and this is important, is first and foremost a spiritual act. It's not just we sign on the dotted line. There's legal ramifications for it and tax ramifications, but marriage is a spiritual act. And if we remove the concept of spirituality from marriage, then I fear we lose a lot of our foundation. We lose a lot of our credibility when we talk about this. Now, the Greek philosopher Plato had an interesting idea. He theorized that humans originally were better than what we are. We were twice as what we were. And we became arrogant because of the skill and the talent and the abilities we had. So the gods got together and they split humans in half. And so the only way for us to be happy is to find our other half. And I praise the Lord that the fact that's not gospel. That's not Jesus' words. Because that would mean that you have to be married to be happy. And Jesus isn't saying you have to be married to be happy. He's not saying you have to find somebody else to be happy. Because if your happiness is dependent upon somebody else, then you're in for disappointment. But Jesus comes in and says, I can give you what you need. But as I said, we tend to search for happiness, for love, for fulfillment, in a lot of the wrong places. And if my happiness is dependent upon someone else, I think that's a dangerous path that either leads me to abuse, to be abused, or other negative things. And one of those negative things can be that of pornography, of self-fulfillment. And one of the things about this is we have to recognize this is not just a male problem. There are too many times where we say, well, this is just a one-gender problem, and we don't even talk about it on the other side. But it's both. And statistics show us that it's prevalent in the church. And so we can sit here today and say, well, this doesn't apply to me. Well, it probably applies to a lot more people than we think it does. And pornography is just dangerous in many ways. And we have the line of thought of you need to remain pure for your spouse or your future spouse and all those types of things, which is important. But one of the things that it does is that it requires that we increase the intensity and the frequency of it, but it damages the frontal lobe in your brain. And the frontal lobe is the area of restraint. The opposite of restraint can be, explosion or erratic behavior. I think if you look around the world enough, you're going to see a lot of erratic behavior, a lot of explosive behavior, a lot of things that you question, is that person in their right mind? And I'm not saying that this is the only cause for the world today and how things are so crazy, but to recognize there are many things in our world that are causing our restraint part of the brain to be diminished, and pornography is one of them. It's one of those things that devalues others. They say it's, certain things are a victimless crime, but it hurts you, it hurts your spouse, your future spouse, your friends, your family, it hurts those who produce it, and those who produce it. That's a big area of human slavery that we just tend to ignore. But the reality is there's nothing good about it. There's nothing beneficial. And all it does is it makes it about me. It makes it selfish. And regardless of what type of relationship you're talking about, if it's selfish, it's bad, it's detrimental, and it doesn't honor Jesus. But if we can particularly get into, the desire side of things, when our desires are fulfilled in positive, God-honoring ways, they are good. But when they aren't, they tend to be really, really destructive. A fire is probably an obvious example. There's several places in our society that we have fires that are good. Your fireplace, your stove, your furnace. If you have a controlled fire, it can heat your house, it can cook your food. It can be very, very good. But when that fire creeps out into a place it shouldn't be, it gets real dangerous real fast. And it's hard to control. So when our desires are trying to be fulfilled and satisfied in ways that don't honor Jesus, they can become real dangerous real fast. But I think the religious leaders did something that we commonly do. They asked a follow-up question to Jesus. They said, but Jesus, hold on. Then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? Then Jesus replied in verse 9, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession because of your hard hearts, but it's not what God originally intended. Unless his wife has been unfaithful, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery. Moses is very revered, particularly by the Jews. Christians revere him as well, but for the Jews, particularly in Jesus' time, he was about as close to a deity as you could get. If he wasn't the most revered person in the Old Testament, he was probably number 2. He was that held in that high of an esteem. But what the religious leaders are referencing is Deuteronomy chapter 24, where it writes, and Moses traditionally wrote Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible. But Deuteronomy 24 says, suppose a man marries a woman, but she does not please him. Having discovered something wrong with her, he writes her a document of divorce and hands it to her and sends her away from his house. When she leaves his house, she is free to marry another man. But if the second husband also turns against her, writes a document of divorce, hands it to her and sends her away, or if he dies, the first husband may not marry her again, for she has been defiled. That's kind of a bit of a mouthful. That's what the religious leaders are referencing. And part of what's happening here is we see how women on some levels are viewed more as a thing, as a possession, than actually a human being compared to men. The husband had to actually be the one to initiate the divorce, had all the power in the relationship. But what Moses is doing here is he's trying to regulate some things, and particularly protect the woman, as the woman had really no legal right. That the man had to fulfill certain requirements in order for the woman to be released from that marriage. And some of the things of the man had to repay the dowry. And then Moses goes on to say, then we can't have all this back and forth remarrying. On some levels, Moses is writing against serial monogamy. We go from one person to another person, but we're not polygamous, we're monogamous in our relationships. But we see, even in this moment, that divorce was relatively easy. In fact, it was a one-sentence statement that had to be written down. So it didn't even take a long time. Didn't even have to be notarized back then. It was easy. Just give a piece of paper and say, go away. Just because you have the right doesn't mean it's right. And we can look at that situation and say, well, that's not good. That's not beneficial. And maybe we have better protections in our world today, but we see that things can be easy. We can easily get out of relationships and do other things and explore other avenues for our happiness and our joy. But Jesus he's not talking about the legal side of things. He's talking about our hearts. He's talking about this is deeper than just what you are legally obligated to do. This is about being faithful to God. And let me pause for a moment. Being faithful to God doesn't mean staying in an abusive relationship. So I just want to make sure I'm clear on that. I'm not saying suck it up, buttercup. That's not my point at all. But we have to make sure we recognize that a lot of the things in our world are broken because the hearts aren't in the right place. It's not because the laws aren't good. It's because my heart isn't where it needs to be. If we move anywhere past that, then we take the spiritual component of it out of the equation. And we recognize that love is both a choice and an emotion. You know, at the beginning, love has all this excitement and passion, and it's great. But that's not a sustainable pace. So there has to be, but if love is just robotic, does it really have any depth to it? Marriage is not like co-signing a mortgage. It's deeper than that. You can co-sign a mortgage with somebody that you just tolerate. But I don't think Jesus says, hey, let's have marriages where we just tolerate each other. I think that's setting the bar as low as we can, because Jesus calls us to something deeper. But he does provide this one place of exception of, someone's been unfaithful, and traditionally this usually refers to adultery. But it begs the question, and I've heard people talk about this, if Jesus said there is one exception to this rule, could we logically conclude that there would be more? But where do we draw the line with what does it mean to be unfaithful? And I don't want to open up that can of worms too much today, but to recognize that Jesus has called us to have a high view of marriage. But there's some times where that high view of marriage crumbles to no fault of your own. And I say no fault, but we recognize that, there's two people in a relationship. Even if it's only 2% of the fault that lies with you, we have to make sure we come to Jesus and say, how can I serve you more effectively? Because it's real easy, whatever we're talking about, to blame somebody else as opposed to me. Because when God created, he created us to fit together. He created us to work together. He created us to have harmonious relationships that serve him, that honor him, bring glory to him, and help us. But there are certain ways that we try to put things together that don't honor Jesus. Jesus is clear when he says a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife. He's clear about being created male and female. And I don't want to belabor the point, but recognize that Jesus affirms man and woman marriage. That's what he does in Matthew 19. Now, you can come and debate to me and say, well, there's something different or whatnot. But I'm saying what Jesus said in Matthew 19 is a man and a woman. That's what he did. And I was hesitant to come to this spot right here because that's probably where everybody's going to remember for now. As we leave here, oh, well, Pastor Jeff just talked out against homosexual sins, which it's sinful. But we talked about other sins as well, that we can't just latch on to this. And you may say, well, Jesus didn't necessarily, maybe Jesus could have expanded more. Well, the traditional Jewish thought at this point was that the traditional teaching was that marriage between a man and a woman. That's what they affirmed. And Jesus, he doesn't hold back when he tries to correct the teaching. But Jesus in this moment decides, well, what the traditional view is good, it's beneficial, and we don't need to change anything with that. But as I'm thinking about this, one of the things I'm reminded is we try to add descriptor words to our identity in Jesus. Scripture doesn't talk about orientation, about sexual orientation, desires. It talks about the act as sinful, not the desire as sinful. And that's a area that we just have to make sure we are careful and intentional about. But there's a lot of people who try to add descriptors in front of who they are. You know, I can say I'm a male Christian, or I'm a white Christian, or I'm a straight Christian. I'll tell you what, we add any descriptor in front of that, then it devalues and takes away from my identity in Jesus Christ. I am someone who is saved by Jesus Christ. I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. That is what it defines me at my core. If I add anything else, it diminishes who I am in Jesus. And I think when we try to add these things, we try to validate ourselves. We try to get fulfillment in ways that aren't healthy. And that may be who you are. I'm not trying to say who you are isn't who you should be. God has created you uniquely. He created you specifically, and He created you in His image. So the best thing we can do is be a follower of Jesus. There's no higher calling. There's no greater fulfillment in our world that we will find. We can't be searching for love, for fulfillment, for validation in all the wrong places. Because Jesus has called us to something deeper. And while the emphasis with this has been marriage, and that may be hard for some of you to hear today, to recognize that this applies to all of our relationships. That if our relationships are selfish, then they're not going to be good. They're not going to honor Jesus. They're not going to be beneficial. So we're all searching for something. We all want to be validated, to find worth. But we're not going to find worth based on how somebody else treats us. We're going to find worth in Jesus Christ, and that calling calls us to humble ourselves to others and serve them. But when we specifically talk about this interaction that Jesus had with the religious leaders today, they talk about how can we make our relationships selfish. They were trying to test him. They were trying to tempt him, and he said, you got to get the heart right, and everything else will fall into place. Everything else will be where it needs to be. You still may encounter sinful people that hurt you. But if your heart's in the right place, then God's going to provide a way for you to stay faithful to Him. He's going to provide a way for you to overcome whatever is thrown at you. But just remember, having the right doesn't make it right. Jesus calls us not just to focus on the legal issue, but on the heart issue. But no matter where you are today, we serve a God who is good. So I hope nobody took this today as me coming after you or being condemning on any way. But I do recognize that you are sinful, that I am sinful, that we are sinful people, and we rely on the goodness and the grace of God to help us.